The chandeliers glittered above the Bellamy estate like a frozen rainstorm of diamonds, casting delicate light over velvet drapes and perfectly chilled glasses of Dom Perignon. Everything about the evening felt curated, too pristine to be spontaneous, too practiced to be sincere. It was one of those charity galas where the words "giving back" floated in the air like perfume, masking the underlying scent of competition and subtle cruelty. Jalen Carter moved quietly through the room, with a tray in hand offering hors d'oeuvres to guests who barely registered him. He wore the uniform of the catering staff, pressed black slacks, a white button-up shirt, shoes polished to a dull shine. But he wasn't part of the catering team. He was just helping his mother Teresa, who had been the housemaid here for almost 2 decades. Tonight, like so many nights before, she had stayed past her hours to make sure things ran smoothly. And as always, Jalen was by her side, not because he had to be, but because that's what you did when you were raised by a woman like Teresa Carter. The party was at full tilt when Marjorie Bellamy spotted him. Draped in a silver gown that shimmered as she moved, Marjorie was the kind of woman who entered a room as if she owned not just the space but the people in it. And in a way she did. She came from old money, oil money, and she wore her pedigree like a crown. Her guests were senators, tech moguls, real estate magnates, all laughing politely in that polished, unbothered tone, unique to those who've never needed to worry about rent. As Jalen passed behind her, Marjorie's voice rose just enough to cut through the low music and murmurs. "You there, young man," she called, sweet as molasses. "You know how to play chess." The room stilled slightly like a ripple across glass. Jalen stopped the tray, balanced effortlessly in one hand. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, ma'am," he said. A few chuckles floated around the circle. One man murmured, "Oh, this ought to be good," while another leaned over and whispered something about a Harlem gambit. Marjorie smiled with the warmth of someone about to step on a bug. "Well then," she gestured toward the ornate chessboard that sat on the coffee table. "Italian marble rarely used more decor than utility. Let's see what you got. I'm curious how strategy works where you come from." Teresa had paused near the far end of the room, frozen mid-placement of cutlery on a side table. Her hand trembled slightly. She didn't look up, didn't call out to stop her son. She just waited. Jalen walked toward the board without hesitation. There was a subtle shift in the room as he moved. Conversations thinned, glasses lowered. Something about his calmness disarmed the audience. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't amused either. He was present, fully, sharply. When he reached the table, Marjorie had already seated herself across from the black side. "I always play white," she said with a little wink. "Family tradition." Jalen nodded. "That's fine. I'm used to starting second." He sat down, adjusting his chair just slightly, then reached forward and began repositioning the black pieces with meticulous care. Each piece was centered with mathematical precision, not a flicker of uncertainty in his fingertips. The bishop, the knight, the pawns in a clean, silent row. One guest, an older man with a Princeton pin on his lapel, leaned in and narrowed his eyes. "He's done that before," he muttered to his wife. Marjorie picked up her queen and spun it absently between her fingers. "This board," she said conversationally, "was imported from Florence. It's handmade. You don't get craftsmanship like this just anywhere." Jalen didn't flinch. "No, ma'am, you really don't." She moved her first piece with confidence, pawn to e4. "Let's begin then. Don't worry, I'll go easy on you." Jalen looked at the board for half a second, then calmly slid his pawn into c5. And just like that, the opening began. A Sicilian defense. The room didn't react at first, but 3 seconds later, a low whisper from someone in the crowd broke the tension. "Did he just—" Another guest leaned forward. "That's not a beginner's move." Marjorie blinked, her painted smile faltering just for a moment. Across the table, Jalen's face remained unreadable, as if he already knew how this game would end. But he said nothing, because sometimes silence wasn't just golden, it was strategy. A subtle current moved through the room after Jalen's unexpected Sicilian reply. It wasn't loud, not even fully conscious, just a collective recalibration, like everyone had slightly misjudged the temperature of the room and now realized it was warmer than they thought. Marjorie adjusted in her chair with a flick of her wrist, then smiled too broadly as if to reclaim control. "Bold move," she said. "Let's see how long that confidence lasts." Jalen didn't answer. His fingers hovered briefly over the knight before he completed his next move, fluid and precise, like he was following a script he'd written years ago. Every motion was clean, intentional. No second guessing, no wasted time. Teresa Carter, standing near the back wall with a linen towel still in her hands, didn't blink. She watched her son the way a lighthouse watches a storm. She had never taught him chess, not really. She didn't know the names of the openings or what a Sicilian meant, but she had taught him discipline, stillness, how to listen longer than he spoke, how to make people uncomfortable without ever raising his voice. And she had taught him how to survive in a world that rarely saw people like them unless they were carrying trays. As Marjorie brought out her bishop and repositioned a pawn, she spoke again almost too casually. "Where did you say you learned to play again?" "I didn't," Jalen replied, eyes fixed on the board. She gave a tight laugh. "Self-taught? Or is this one of those YouTube prodigy things, no videos? Just books," he said. "From the library." That explains the improvisation." Her tone wrapped the word like a polite insult, and a few nearby guests chuckled, though with a bit less confidence than earlier. Jalen made another move. The rhythm of his game was unsettling, not rushed, not flashy, just deliberate. One by one, the guests began to notice it wasn't luck or enthusiasm driving him. It was clarity, preparation. What no one in that room knew was that Jalen had spent the last 7 years memorizing lines of play from secondhand paperbacks with yellowed pages and handwritten notes in the margins. His world was late-night strategy diagrams and dawn games against himself. While other kids played video games, he worked his way through the classics, Fischer, Kasparov, Karpov, until the names felt like old friends. He didn't need to glance at the clock or think hard. He was already 10 moves deep, and he'd played this match before. Not with the same opponent, no, but the dynamic was familiar. Someone powerful, someone dismissive, someone who believed the ability to purchase luxury equaled the right to belittle. Marjorie furrowed her brow. Her bishop had been forced into an awkward corner, and she didn't seem to notice that her central pawns were vulnerable, already unraveling. She moved a rook toward the middle of the board, a defensive gesture. Safe, predictable. One of the guests leaned toward another and whispered, "She's already behind." Jalen remained silent. He didn't smirk. He didn't rush. He made his next move with the grace of someone who'd already made peace with what came after the game was over. Across the room, Teresa slowly folded the towel in her hands. Her knuckles had gone white, but in her eyes something calm was building. She knew what was happening. Maybe not on the board, but in the air, in the posture of the guests, in the widening silence between each move. The room wasn't laughing anymore. And Jalen, her boy, who used to play with paper pieces on cardboard squares while she cleaned toilets, was now seated in the middle of a silent circle of wealth and power, and none of them could look away. Not because he was out of place, but because for the first time they weren't sure if they were still the smartest people in the room. By the 12th move, the shift was undeniable. Jalen wasn't reacting to Marjorie's play, he was directing the game, shaping it. The board no longer looked ornamental, it looked alive, like a battlefield slowly tilting in his favor. Marjorie, meanwhile, was losing the sparkle in her voice. She reached for her champagne glass more often now, each sip a little longer, each glance at the board a little tighter. Her smile was thinner, and she no longer narrated her moves to entertain the room. Jalen broke her center open with a subtle pawn exchange, something so small that most in the room missed the trap. But not the older gentleman near the fireplace, the one with silver temples and a quiet gaze. He leaned toward his wife and whispered, "That was a sacrifice, not a mistake." She nodded, eyes fixed on the board. "He's baiting her." Teresa stood with her hands clasped low, her face unreadable. But in her chest, her heart was pounding. She could feel something stirring, something big, quiet and slow, like a tide turning beneath the surface. Marjorie took a deep breath and moved her queen too soon. Jalen's reply came instantly, bishop to g5, pinning the knight. It was beautiful, simple, elegant. The kind of move that didn't just threaten, it revealed. Exposed weakness. The air inside the room grew heavier. A few guests looked at one another, unsure if they were witnessing a game or something else entirely. A reckoning, perhaps. "I don't like his attitude," Marjorie muttered under her breath, as if Jalen's silence were somehow louder than her condescension. But it wasn't attitude. It was poise. Jalen didn't gloat, didn't fidget, didn't even raise his eyes. He just kept playing one clean move after another, like this wasn't the first time he'd sat across from someone who thought they were untouchable. Because it wasn't. There had been a math teacher once who laughed when Jalen finished a quiz in 10 minutes. Double check your answers, he'd said, unless you want a failing grade. Jalen had gotten a perfect score. There was a police officer who stopped him walking home from the library, asked what he had in his backpack, like it couldn't possibly be books. And there was Marjorie now sitting in front of him, slowly unraveling as the position tightened, as her pieces crowded one another in confusion, as she realized too late that she was in a game she thought she'd be controlling. She glanced up, finally looking at Jalen like she was trying to see him for the first time, but all she saw was a calm young man, with hands still, and a gaze fixed not on her, but on the board. On the truth. You're being very quick, she said, voice thinner now. In real chess, people take their time. They think. They plan. Jalen moved his rook into position with the ease of someone breathing. I've been planning, he said softly, for years. Across the room, someone set their drink down slowly, reverently. No one was scrolling their phones anymore. No one was laughing. Even the music's soft jazz piped through the overhead speakers seemed to fade into the walls. Another move. Another step toward inevitability. And then as Marjorie reached for a piece with fingers that now trembled slightly, Jalen finally looked up. Not smug, not defiant, just steady. He met her eyes and said without the slightest hint of cruelty, "You don't need more time. You just didn't expect to lose." And with that, he turned back to the board, quiet, focused, and ready for the endgame he'd seen coming all along. The words hung in the air, calm, honest, almost too soft to sting, but they landed with weight. Around the room, a strange stillness settled. No one reached for drinks anymore. No one dared murmur. It was as if everyone realized at once that this wasn't a game anymore. This was a reckoning. Marjorie's fingers froze mid-air, her ringed hand trembling slightly as she hovered over her knight. The piece had nowhere to go, not really. Her queen was boxed in. Her pawns were fractured. Her control was an illusion that had quietly crumbled 6 moves ago. I didn't come here to be embarrassed, she said almost under her breath. Jalen didn't respond. He simply moved, a calculated, controlled shift of his bishop, cutting off her only escape route. There was no flash, no showmanship, but the move said everything. And for the first time, truly, Marjorie saw it. This boy, this quiet, unassuming son of her maid, wasn't surviving this game. He was mastering it. The guests could feel it too. That creeping awareness that they'd all underestimated him. That maybe the most powerful person in the room wasn't the one who owned the chandelier, but the one playing under its light without blinking. Teresa stepped forward. It was just a step, but it carried history, years of scrubbing floors, folding sheets, raising her son in borrowed light. She didn't speak yet. She just stood straighter. Chin lifted, her gaze locked on her boy, like he was the North Star. Across the table, Marjorie sat back, blinking slowly. This is a setup, she muttered. You've been coached. Someone's trained you to humiliate me. Jalen's eyes didn't even flicker. No, ma'am, he said. I've just been watching. The room held its breath, and then without fanfare, he made the move. Queen to G6, a double threat. If Marjorie protected her king, she'd lose her queen. If she protected the queen, she'd be mated in 3. Silence, pure heavy silence. One man near the window murmured, Jesus Christ, under his breath, almost reverently. Another sat down slowly as if watching the board had taken something out of him. Marjorie didn't speak. Her fingers twitched over the board, but her eyes darted unsure, scanning for a way out that didn't exist. Finally, Teresa spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. I once told my son, she said, eyes still on Jalen, that one day someone would try to make him feel small, and that the best answer wasn't shouting. It was showing up, with grace, with knowledge, and letting the truth sit where it belongs. She turned her gaze to Marjorie, then, not angry, not smug. Just clear. Seems like that day came. Marjorie didn't respond. She couldn't. Her hand hovered helplessly above the king piece, and then without ceremony, she nudged it forward, gently tipping it on its side. Checkmate. There was no applause. No cheering. Just the soft exhale of realization, like the room had collectively remembered how to breathe. Jalen leaned back, slightly folded his hands and waited. Marjorie looked up at him, eyes rimmed with disbelief. "You didn't win because you're smarter," she said, voice low and brittle. "You just memorized a trick." Jalen met her gaze evenly. "I won because I respected the game," he said, "and maybe that's what you forgot." And with that he stood. No bow, no boast, just dignity, enough to fill a mansion. Marjorie didn't move for a long moment. She stared at the toppled king like it might right itself if she waited long enough. Around her the murmurs had returned, soft, cautious, no longer about the game, but about her. What had just unfolded wasn't just a defeat, it was a public reckoning, and she was smart enough to feel it settling on her shoulders. Jalen stood quietly, his posture, relaxed hands at his sides. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He simply looked calm in a way that unnerved the very people who'd spent their lives equating silence with submission. A few of the guests stepped away from the circle. One man cleared his throat and said something about checking on his driver. Another woman suddenly remembered she had a call to take. Nobody wanted to be too close to the epicenter now that it had cracked. Marjorie slowly turned toward the room as if expecting someone to rescue her, to say something, anything that would make this moment feel less like an unraveling. But the faces she found weren't offering lifelines, they were unreadable, even a little cold. For the first time in her life, Marjorie Bellamy looked around a room and saw not admiration, but discomfort. She rose stiffly from her chair. "This was clearly meant to humiliate me," she said too loudly. "I've supported this community for years. I've given jobs, opportunities, scholarships, and this is how I'm repaid." No one responded. Across the room, Teresa folded the towel she'd been holding and walked to her son's side. Her chin was high and there was no apology in her step. Jalen turned to her, his voice gentle. "You ready, Mom?" Teresa nodded, then turned once to face the room. Not out of vengeance, but from something stronger. Clarity. "For 19 years, she said, I've served this house. I've cleaned up after your parties, scrubbed lipstick from your glasses, and smiled when no one remembered my name. But today I watched my son do something that had nothing to do with class or money or titles. He just played a fair game. And that's more than some of you can say." There was a pause, then a slow shuffle of footsteps as she and Jalen made their way toward the exit. The crowd parted without a word. But just before they reached the doorway, a voice cut through the silence. "Jalen." He turned. It was a man in a charcoal suit, one of the quieter guests who had stood near the back the whole evening. He stepped forward, pulling a card from his wallet. "I'm a trustee at Barrington Prep. Full scholarship, room and board. If you're interested." Jalen looked at the card, then at the man's eyes. "I'm interested," he said. The man nodded. "Call me Monday." Teresa looked at her son, and for the first time that night, a tear escaped. But it wasn't sorrow. It was release. They stepped outside into the cool night air, the door closing gently behind them. Inside the room remained still, Marjorie alone at the board, the king still lying on its side. The guests didn't speak. They just looked at one another, each wondering the same quiet thing. How did we get it so wrong? By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread quietly, at first in whispers among those who had been there, then faster, louder across group chats, emails, private forums. A teenage boy had humiliated Marjorie Bellamy at her own charity gala. And not with protest signs or loud declarations, but with a chessboard and silence. 3 days later, a leaked video surfaced. Someone no one ever admitted who had recorded the final few minutes of the match. It wasn't the moves that caught the public's attention, though chess forums would later break them down frame by frame. It was the stillness, the sheer composure of Jalen, the restraint, the way his mother stepped forward, like a woman who had waited her whole life to be seen and refused to lower her eyes when the moment arrived. Within 48 hours, the clip passed 1 million views. Headlines followed: checkmate at the country club, the Maid son who outsmarted a millionaire, when power sat across from Grace and lost. Marjorie tried to ignore it at first. She issued no statement, hoping it would pass like a bad weather system. But the storm only grew stronger. Calls from donors slowed. A board she'd chaired for 12 years requested she temporarily step back. The boutique foundation she funded was quietly dropped from 2 upcoming events. She didn't lose everything, not right away. But she lost the thing she'd always relied on most: presence. The ability to walk into any room and command it unquestioned. Meanwhile, Jalen's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from schools, organizations, even journalists, most of which he ignored. But he didn't ignore the email from Barrington Prep, nor the one that came the next day from a university chess director who had watched the video on loop and offered a mentorship, no strings attached. But Jalen didn't want interviews. He didn't want praise. He wanted space. So he went to the library, the same one he'd walked to after school for years, the same one where he'd once hidden a torn copy of The Art of Attack in Chess behind a row of cookbooks because it had no barcode and technically didn't belong there. The librarian saw him and smiled. "You're the boy from the video," he nodded. "About time the world saw you," she said. He just shrugged. It wasn't about them. In the weeks that followed, Jalen started working on something new, something he'd dreamed about in the quiet hours after cleaning jobs. Something that didn't require a mansion or marble. A free chess program for kids with no coaches, no budgets, and no voice. He called it Back Row Kings. Within a month, over 300 students had signed up. Volunteers from 3 states offered to help. A small tech company built a simple interface to host online games and recorded lessons. When asked why he started it, Jalen only said, "The back row matters. It's where most of us start. Doesn't mean we stay there." Teresa watched it all unfold with a quiet pride that didn't ask to be celebrated. She still cleaned houses, though not Marjorie's. Not anymore. A local hotel offered her a supervisor position with full benefits. She took it not because it paid more, though it did, but because the manager looked her in the eye during the interview. Marjorie, for her part, retreated. For the first time in her life, she stopped being invited. And while Jalen didn't see her again, he sometimes wondered what stuck with her most. The silence in the room that night, or the moment she realized the boys she dismissed had never needed her validation to matter. Either way, she'd become part of the lesson, and he had become the proof. 6 months later, the leaves in Brooklyn had turned brittle gold, and the air smelled like cold metal and change. Jalen walked down the wide tree-lined path of Barrington Prep's campus, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his collar slightly crooked the way his mom still tried to fix every morning, though now she only got to do it over FaceTime. It was his first semester, and he was already tutoring juniors in strategy and logic. Not just chess, but how to think, how to slow down, how to anticipate the room. Most of them didn't know about the video, or if they did, they didn't bring it up. Here he wasn't the boy who'd embarrassed a millionaire. He was just Jalen Carter. Quiet, brilliant, kind of impossible to beat at anything that required a plan. He liked that. Back Row Kings had grown beyond what he imagined. The program had reached 10 states with local clubs forming in places where kids had never touched a chessboard before. What started with a used laptop in his bedroom had become something he couldn't control, and that too was a new feeling. But a good one. Teresa had framed the first news article about the program. It sat next to an old photo of Jalen in a hand-me-down winter coat, grinning with 2 missing teeth. She hadn't hung them in the living room where guests could see. She put them in the hallway just outside her bedroom, where she'd see them every morning when she left for work. Sometimes after long days, Jalen would call her and just listen to her, tell him about her staff who got promoted, who needed a ride home, what the manager had said about the way she handled a guest complaint. She didn't know it, but those were his favorite calls, because she didn't talk about pride. She talked about purpose. Meanwhile, Marjorie Bellamy had become almost a ghost in the circles she once ruled. The golf club quietly let her membership lapse. Her name was left off the spring gala she'd funded for a decade. Even her friends, those smiling, champagne-holding fixtures, seemed to look past her now, like her presence no longer polished the room. She had tried once to reach out. An email. 2 sentences. "I didn't know you were that good. I hope you make something of it." Jalen never replied, because it wasn't about being that good. It never had been. It was about being seen, fully, without qualifiers. On a cold Friday morning, he found himself in the school library between classes. A younger student approached him, small, nervous, maybe 13. "You're Jalen, right?" He nodded. The kid held out a wrinkled notebook. "I started playing last month. I lose a lot, but I figured maybe I could get better if I had the right books, or, I don't know, if I watched someone who didn't quit." Jalen smiled, taking the notebook gently. Losing means you're learning, he said. Want to play a quick game? They sat down across from each other. No crowd, no crystal chandeliers, just the soft scrape of wood against wood and the rhythm of thought. As the game unfolded, Jalen let the boy find his footing. He gave space for mistakes, nudged the game forward when it stalled. Not to win, just to guide. At one point, the boy looked up and asked, "What's the most important move?" Jalen thought for a long second. "The one where you stop believing what other people expect of you," he said. "That's when the game really starts." And somewhere deep in his chest, something settled. Not victory, not satisfaction, but peace. The kind you earn when you no longer need to prove anything. When the board is quiet, the peace is still, and you know you've already won. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another Jalen is waiting for the world to see his worth. Thank you for watching.